In this video, we're going to be talking about margin of error. So we've got a definition here. Margin of error is an amount, and it's typically a small percent, a small amount, that is allowed for in case of miscalculation or a change of circumstances. So it's just like a little interval of error possibility.
Yeah, just a little thing. Just a little thing. Just a little thing. Just a little thing. Ability?
Disability.
Ability?
Disability.
Ability?
Disability.
Ability?
Disability.
Ability. Disability. Welcome to Radio Tipping Point. My name is Mike Boyle, and our show today is titled The Margin of Error. So as you can probably guess from the title, we're going to try to hang out with those on the margins.
Well, I also think the times in which we live remind us of the things that we care about. And so oddly, I think it sort of brought into focus the things that we find valuable because we've had to deal with this moment in time. And so you're always trying to challenge yourself. I think we get into this thing where we want to win the argument. And which is a way of something you talk about often is escalating. Don't escalate.
Don't escalate.
Well,
yeah.
winning the argument or seeking to do that is an escalation of a kind.
Yes, it is.
And it's like, well then, and it's no more appropriate for me to demonize Donald Trump than for him to demonize members of MSNBC. who I'm certain he demonizes more than MS-13. But it's so you kind of say, we all have, this innate goodness and unshakable goodness, and it's there. Everybody has that. There are no exceptions to that. And that I think he's kind of worthy of our compassion, because I can't imagine. Anyway, if you can get to that place, which is hard to get to. But then it reminds you of what matters to us. What do we care about? And where do we want to stand in the face of it all? Then it becomes not so much a denunciation, though you have to clearly go to the border and resist, as people are doing today. But it's also announcing about the power of connection and relational wholeness and kinship, and we belong to each other, and we've forgotten that we belong to each other.
There is nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. William Shakespeare. So what does this actually mean? People on the margins. On a general level, that we're inferring that people do not fit into the norm, whatever that norm may be. So it's a form of categorization. I thought it was interesting in preparation for the show today. I started thinking about this word margin and was able to come up with all kinds of definitions. Not too dissimilar to this idea, the margin of error. Something's marginal, which means that it's not significant. And the idea of people who live on the margins they are not seen as being significant. But of course, the word margin has a completely different meaning within the realm of economics, because your margin is basically your profit. And so you're trying to increase the margin. And within that realm, I realized this paradox in the use of the words ability and disability, that we've taken the ability away. And I think we would agree that those individuals with disabilities would be considered to be on the margin of society. They are not in the majority. But that is to infer that the abilities that we have, that we've always had them, and they don't possibly diminish through time, which of course is a complete fallacy. That means we as individuals are following a path where we continually become disabled, following that definition. So looking at the word from this particular context, does that mean that we have no abilities? That's right. I thought you would agree with me. Of course that we have abilities. Why would we think that we don't have abilities just because our eyesight has gotten worse, or our hearing's become worse, our memories become worse? Does not mean that we do not possess any type of abilities. So does the same rule apply to those individuals who we consider to be disabled? Could they possibly have abilities that we don't have? I could see you nodding your head in approval and agreeing that, yes, that's a gotcha. So how do people end up on the margins? Are they born that way? Meaning that very possibly it might be dispositional. If they're born that way, then it must be dispositional. Or that landing in the margins, is that something that takes place through time? And of course, there's all kinds of different ways of looking at that particular situation. So let's go through a few, shall we? So you're born into a family, and let's say that family is dysfunctional. Either the father is not there, or the mother is not there, Or maybe both of them are not there. Let's make this one even more interesting. That was not their choice whether they are there or not. But let's assume that something tragic took place. Something they did not plan. Something that they could not avoid. Something that is clearly linked to chance. And that's a very easy situation to envision, considering the fun and games that have been taking place roughly about 1,000 kilometers to our east of Vienna. Perhaps your parents stayed and you were sent somewhere else. So in other words, they stayed at home, but you were exiled. And the intention there was that you would have a better chance. So let's stay with that narrative. Let's say you were exiled. And let's say you ended up here. So the abilities that you might have had at home very possibly will not be recognized here for whatever reason it may be, either through the ability to express yourself in a very natural way, or perhaps your abilities are not seen as being important within this new society. Or very possibly, it is intentional that your abilities are not recognized. And we see plenty of these examples every day when I think about the individuals within our society who are completing some sort of menial activities, knowing full well that they have a whole slew of abilities that are not being utilized, but either they're not recognized or it's considered to be too much of a hurdle due to all of these other disabilities that they have, that we allow for all of these individuals not to reach their potential. I ran across a very interesting statistic not too long ago that took me for a loop. I was not expecting this number. In conjunction with a project very much tied to dealing with people on the margins, those being migrants, I looked up, so how many of us are there here? I had made a wild guess that probably around 25%. So I hope you're all sitting. Take a deep breath. In a city of 1.9 million people, roughly, over 800,000 are non-Austrians. So I'm going to put them all in the migrant category. And for those of you who are looking to come up with a significant figure that's based on a percentage, that would be 42%. That's right, folks, 42% of the inhabitants of this glorious city of ours are seen as being on the margin. Because, of course, we know that most messages are not addressed towards us. The ability to make our voice count is very much constrained. And that is one huge slice of the population if we are looking to make sure that our society is pluralistic. Or at least that would be the hope that I would have as to what our goal would be. And of that 42%, most of them were not looking for a holiday in the sun. But their actions were tied to compulsion, aka they had no choice. But those people are considered to be on the margins of the society. Well, with such a high number, I'm starting to question to what degree we are actually the norm. But let's leave that perspective to the side. The point is not to put people into camps. And in fact, that should be the point. In the example that Father Greg Boyle gave, where he talks about winning the argument, if we are capable of reminding ourselves that very often when something takes place, although our immediate reaction is that it has something to do with us, actually, you know what? It has nothing to do with us. That's right, nothing, absolutely nothing. So when people react the way they do, they're not thinking about us. Very possibly we might think that that message was directed towards us. And very possibly the reaction was as such. But that would mean that we are the trigger which leads me to this idea that was fostered by a gentleman by the name of Fritz Heider, who was an Austrian Jew who actually migrated to the United States way before the shock and awe took place here in Europe in the 30s. And he, of all places to land in the United States, he ended up in Kansas. So I can imagine there was a time where Fritz would be clicking his heels and chanting, "There is no realm like Gestalt." And within this theory that he put together, it's called the fundamental attribution error. I think it very much describes our viewpoint as to all those people on the margins, and maybe some that aren't there, or we'll create a new category for people, like the deplorables. And within this concept, the fundamental attribution error, Haider mentions that if we have issues with others, they are tied to the dispositional, meaning they were born that way. And of course, that's always our easy explanation to delegate people into that marginal category. Well, they were born that way. So they have a problem with drugs or alcohol. Well, that was bound to happen because they came from the margins. And we know that all the people in the margins, they have serious problems. So we shouldn't be surprised. So within Haider's theory, he comes to a very interesting revelation that, so that's fine when we're talking about others. We are more than happy to put the dispositional tag on them. But when it comes to ourselves, oh no, that looks much, much different. There we say that it was the situation that led to these actions. I couldn't make it today because I just wasn't feeling well enough. I was rather aggressive yesterday because I didn't sleep very well. I had to steal these items because they treated me bad at one time and I wanted to pay them back. That sort of thing. And within this realm that Haider talks about, there is one specific bias that he refers to, and it's called the correspondence bias. The correspondence bias infers that the situation or the problem as such could have been tied to a situation or a situational influence. But we continue to throw it into the dispositional camp. And with most of the people on the margins, we tend to forget about the situational meaning if that situation had not appeared, or if we are able to change the structures that led to that situation taking place to begin with, that very possibly, and most probably, I would argue, we change the behavior. Inability. 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 Liability. 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 Liability.
And because you want to be that tender glance, you go to the margins. And you fast like Miguel Lugo. And you say, we're going to love you into submission, and we're going to imagine a circle of compassion, and then imagine nobody standing outside of it. Together we're going to, with tenderness and an open heart, we want to dismantle the barriers that exclude. And pretty soon we all cease to care whether anyone accuses us of wasting our time. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing.
And because we have typecast those people on the margins to be the dispositional villains, we struggle in thinking about any positive attributes, as that would ruin our picture of our enemy. And following that of what Greg mentioned, what actually happens if we find within ourselves the ability to free ourselves of that necessity of holding an enemy, and with that, we take the weapon out of the hands of the individuals on the other side. Because we say, you are worthy. Because we are able to say that we are worthy. And with that, the word we truly infers the plural. But we know that's no easy endeavor. We struggle. And one of the biggest parts of that game that we play is all tied to, I'm going to use a phrase of a friend of mine when talking about the devil triangle. His terminology is victor, victim, villain. And we might be playing all three roles, even possibly within one situation. So if you follow the local politics, and it's certainly not unique for Austria, those people in the margins, we've put them into one of these two buckets. The ones that are the victims are the ones that are fleeing the war that is to be found roughly 1,000 kilometers to our east. But we have a number of individuals that were in this equal amount of despair. And due to war or persecution or a combination, they were forced to flee where they considered their home to be, and they ended up here as well. But they're not necessarily looked upon as being victims anymore. They are seen as being villains. And I've seen that transformation over the years, where those individuals who were fleeing prosecution, persecution, the danger of war, that we considered our house to be a safe house for all. But unfortunately not anymore, and not for a long time. And what about us? What's the role that we like playing if we follow the elements of the fundamental attribution error and the correspondence bias? Then we really do not want to play the villain, because we equate villainhood as being something you're born into. Could even be a cultural characteristic. So either we'll take on the victor, who's the one who is trying to save others. And we see this within the various campaigns that seem to be on permanent display, where certain organizations are looking for money to help the victims. And by giving them some money, we get to be the victors. And that makes us feel good. And in those instances where we are not able to play the victors, then of course the role that we take on is being the victim. Again, tied to a situation that took place and we couldn't do anything about it. And I would never claim that that doesn't happen, that situations do take place. Looking at a very simple, straightforward example that will be coming our way, no doubt. Our happy days will end. Companies will decide that they do not need to directly partake in any activities in our market, or they'll consolidate the business somewhere else. And those individuals end up on the street as unemployed. And you would think that within that example, that would be a hard stretch to come to the conclusion that people were born that way. They were born to be unemployed. But if you listen to conversations, very often they will be thrown into that category regardless. Or if we think about the number of children that live in poverty in this country, when they're young, they might be seen as being the victim, but that label doesn't last forever. There will be a point in time where the correspondence bias will kick in, and we will say they choose to live that life. So within this constellation, victor, villain, and victim are we truly caught in that dilemma, and there is no way for us to get out? Within the model that Vic Tezatel explained to me, and he's written some pieces on it as well, he sees very slim possibilities of getting out of the model. And I tend to disagree. So how do we remove ourselves from this model? Well, the first step we can and should take is being very conscious of the role that we're currently playing. And at the same time, once we have caught ourselves in the act, that we do not make that same mistake tied to the idea of the correspondence bias. And there's the other one that we haven't talked about so far, and that is the idea of guilt and shame. So we catch ourselves in the act, and the first thing we do is that we forgive ourselves. And we say that we are not perfect. It is a model that does not work for human beings. No siree bub. So the first step would be to forgive yourself. And I would argue that that is a prerequisite before we can actually forgive others. Truly forgive others, is that we're able to forgive ourselves. So that would be step number one. Step number two would be to ask yourself the question, so within this dilemma that we find ourselves to be in, what choices do we have? We can continue to play the game, or we can discontinue our activities. But very possibly that alone won't be enough. Because we have some others that are involved in this game. And if you just bail, then they're going to be angry. And none of this has to be logical, folks. None of this has to be logical, but very often the other players are going to be angry. What, you refuse to be the victim? That means I can no longer be the victor. What, you refuse to be the villain? Then that ruins this picture I have of myself as being the victim. Can you imagine that one happening? I would say it's guaranteed. So don't expect by just bailing the game that you're able to solve all these problems. Very possibly some new ones will come in. And so we want you to be prepared. So when you decide that you do have a free choice, and sometimes the choices that we have are not the most comfortable, but we relish in the fact that it's our choice. And we are ready to live with the consequences. So how do we move forward with the others when you decide that you don't want to play this game anymore? In certain situations, you might have to make a decision whether that relationship that you have with either one or both is really worth it. And we've seen that for a number of people, that terrible relationships are still better than the alternate. And that would be not having any relationships at all. So this decision might take some courage. Are we responsible for the actions of the others? No, we're not. Again, that doesn't make that decision any easier. But they're responsible for their actions, not you and me. So maybe one of the struggles that we'll need to deal with is that false sense of responsibility, which is actually already inferring that we cannot live in not being the victors. And that indeed is one of the big struggles that we have tied to this game. And transparency very often could be very raw. And very uncomfortable. And will require a lot of energy. And it will require a lot of soul searching. Vic came up with a great line that I'd like to read to you. Turbulence, conflict, disagreement are healthy, but have to be placed within the context of our humanity, not our productivity. Great insight. How does that fall in line with all of that of what I've been talking about so far in the show? Humanity equals forgiveness equals acceptance. Not necessarily in that order. It would be humanity, acceptance, forgiveness. Could look different on certain situations, but I would say that we need to be able to accept the situation so that we come to the conclusion that guilt and shame bring no added value. And when we refuse to use those weapons that we have in our arsenal that act as a smokescreen, then that means that we are accepting of all of these other points that Vic mentioned, the turbulence, the conflict, the disagreements. So now let's take those three words and dig a little bit deeper. I think from turbulence, we know all about turbulence. I think we could all write our individual books on turbulence over the last 2+ years. And in spite of the message that we're getting from the powers that be, the turbulence isn't over, folks, and very possibly never will. So either we can draw a triangle and come up with somebody to blame for the turbulence, because it's quite clear that for the most part, we'll take misery over uncertainty any day. But if we learn to accept the turbulence, then all of a sudden we have a new paradigm. And in fact, when I think about it, the other two words are all part of those dominoes that fall. Because of the turbulence, we have created conflict because we cannot plan. We are continuously being surprised because the narrative that we have in our head isn't taking place anymore. So with that, conflict ensues. And in fact, the disagreement part can be directly derived from the conflict per se. But again, if we assume that we can accept all of that, if we can imagine ourselves after performing the act of acceptance, then basically we have freed ourselves of these conditions. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's certainly possible. And we're able to forgive ourselves from maybe our reactions that are taking place. And we take the weapons out of the hands of the others because we do not play the game anymore. And the conflict and the disagreements that I was referring to and deciding not to play the game, that's really what we're referring to here, right? And if we can blow up this model that people are on the margins, and we think about all these groups that are of individuals that we put into the margins, I think we add up all these margins, all these marginals, that they are actually in the majority. We are in the majority. And the norm is the non-norm. That this idea is an illusion. And we need to figure out ways to accept. And the last comment tied to what Vic was talking about, and I agree with him wholeheartedly, that vulnerability is really the key here. That we are able to manage that healthy state in relishing in being ourselves, warts and all, and knowing full well that we have the power to manage the tone which is to be found within our environment. And if there's one thing I'd like to wish for all of you, would be precisely that. Thanks a lot for listening. And I will be back next week. And I'm looking forward to it already.